We have the new Sony a7IV. It is the upgrade for the April 2018 Sony a7 III that really changed the world. This was a historic camera.
I remember when that came out, we were on the press trip. No one could believe how good it was focusing. No one could believe the price. It was $2,000, so it was like $600 less than we thought that it would be. And it's an amazing camera.
So many people switched from Canon and Nikon DSLRs to the Sony mirrorless system, and that's really what propelled Sony to being the #1 mirrorless camera company. And they finally updated it.
We're gonna put it up against the a7 III with wildlife, portraits, focusing, and compare some of the new features that it has, like some new buttons, the new price point, and some other things too.
If you want to see us compare it to the Canon R6 and some other cameras, subscribe, because we have those videos coming up soon. Sony has really improved the controls on it, so let's talk about that. You have a flip screen.
Yeah, you just have a tilty screen, which is inferior. Mine is a fully articulating flip screen, but what I'm even more excited about, Tony, is some of these locking buttons. So you have an exposure compensation dial, which...
It always gets hit accidentally.
I like it, but it does get hit. This one has a lock on it, and it's reprogrammable, so it doesn't have the numbers of the exposure compensation dial, and that's because you can assign different functions to this button.
The new Sony a7IV has the record button on the front here, so it's accessible to people vlogging and filming themselves. There's also a separate dial that switches between still and video and slow motion, S and Q mode, and that allows you to switch into aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode. On the old a7 III, you had one video mode, and then changing modes required you to go into the menu system.
Speaking of the menu system, they also updated the menu system, which I'm so happy about. It's easier, it's more intuitive, there's a touch screen, and it seems overall better, but we'll get more into that later.
You want to start by taking some portraits?
Sure, I think we need lenses.
Yeah, people are mad about this. This is the older Sony a7 III with the new Sony 7200 f2.8 GM Mark II. I'm going to take some portraits and see how it does with eye detect. It does have human eye detect as well as animal eye detect, but you know, it's a little slow, and sometimes it focuses right on her nose instead of her eye. Let's see if the new camera does any better.
Let me look away. I'm gonna try to make it challenging. One eye covered. Can you do that? Didn't think so.
Yeah, actually it's nailing it.
Oh.
This is focusing so much better. It acts like a baby A1. Whenever she turns away, it snaps right back onto the eye. It pretty much always nails the nearest eye. Briefly focused away on a few things, but overall really good. I'm having no problems with buffering, which is a problem on the Sony a7 III, even just shooting fast-paced portraits. Sony replaced one of the SD cards with a CF Express Type A card, which is way, way faster. So I'm writing RAW files to this. The other slot is still just SD, but I always used just JPEGs to the second card anyway as a backup. So both cards have more throughput than the last model. You'll have to spend a few more bucks if you do want to get the CF Express Type A card. You can still use 2 SD cards. Man, I just couldn't see any difference in the portraits. Even zoomed in 200%, they both looked very sharp. Now, the old Sony a7 III did seem to render skin tones with a little bit more green, and the a7 IV shifted them a little bit more towards magenta. I think the skin tones on the a7 IV look a little bit better, but I wouldn't bother upgrading for this. On the old a7 III, you literally can't touch the menus. You have to navigate everything with a stick.
The a7 IV does have a touch menu, which is nice, and you can turn that off, I learned, from hitting the little trash button, which I accidentally did, so be careful about that. It's also nice because you can bring up your menu from your function button, and let's say you want to change your exposure compensation, you just touch it. This is looking a little more like the Canon menu system, and I have to say, I really appreciate the updates. Good job, Sony. You take constructive criticism well.
You want to test tracking? Now let's try shooting sports. The a7IV has 10 frames per second, just like the a7III, and that makes it kind of slow compared to cameras like the 20 frames per second Canon R6. But if the autofocusing algorithm is better, we might actually get more sharp shots per second. So let's try it out. Both cameras have 10 frames per second, and indeed the Sony a7 III and a7 IV both took about the same number of shots across 2 runs, but they didn't get the same number of shots sharp. The Sony a7 IV got 40% more sharp shots thanks to its vastly improved autofocus system, so you can see if you're an action shooter, the a7 IV is worth the upgrade. Now I'm using the a7 IV vlog style with the flippy screen, which is a really nice feature, and using the on-camera mic. This is our cameraman, Frank Donardi. You just spent some time with the a7 III and a7 IV. What are the improvements in the video features?
The a7 IV is definitely faster to focus. I used to shoot a ton of video with the a7 III. Now I shoot with the a7S III. This feels much more like the a7S III. I shot at f11 and I would put it in between flowers that were like right in front of me, and then I would bring it back. It would come into focus very nicely. I put it in the expandable flexible spot, put it at f2.8. I would focus on something far away and then focus on something closer. It came right into focus. It feels very snappy, and it was very much improved over the a7 III.
Thank you, Frank.
You're welcome.
We're planning an entirely separate review of the a7 IV as a vlogging camera, so subscribe to see that. In the meantime, here's Chelsea walking towards the camera with autofocus tracking. The focusing on the a7 IV is definitely faster than on the a7 III. It also does a good job of sticking to the subject, whereas the a7 III will wander off to random unrelated things. The a7 IV tends to really lock on, almost like a baby A1. I never recommended the a7 III for wildlife, but the a7 IV is great. The bird and animal IAF worked awesome. Pictures were sharp and detailed. This is a good choice. Is 33 megapixels enough for wildlife photography? You tell me. With our 600mm f4 and teleconverter, we could see a pretty substantial difference in resolution. The Sony a7 IV's 33 megapixels was noticeably sharper. Still, the difference isn't huge, and this is with a $13,000 lens. Less expensive lenses would show less of a difference. Here's another wildlife example, and in this one I really don't see any difference between the two cameras, probably because of the atmospheric conditions. The farther you are from the subject, the more the atmosphere just kills your sharpness, making megapixels not even matter. So upgrading to the a7 IV is certainly worth it when you can get close and use a high quality lens. We took the a7 IV to Martha's Vineyard to test it for travel and landscapes, and it performed flawlessly. The battery life lasted forever, the body was small and light, it was fun to use. It's the perfect travel camera. Squinting at these pictures at 400%, I really can't see any difference in image quality. I kind of expected sharper images from the new a7 IV. Subscribe to see our full review of the raw image quality versus the a7 III, Canon R6, and other competitors. And now our sensor stabilization test performed handheld with the Sony 55mm f1.8. We found that the Sony a7 III was pretty reliable at about 3 stops below the reciprocal roll. It advertises 5 stops of sensor stabilization. We found that the Sony a7 IV was about a stop worse. Even though Sony advertises it as having improved sensor stabilization, we couldn't validate that. Thus, handheld low light, the Sony a7 III seems like the better buy. What do you think? Should people upgrade from the a7 III to the a7 IV?
I think that if they're going to benefit from the improved autofocus and if they would appreciate the tilt screen, the extra megapixels, then yeah, they should go for it.
I think sports and wildlife, no doubt, totally worth the upgrade. For portraits, unless you're having a specific problem that the a7 IV would solve, you probably don't need to upgrade. And same advice for people buying a new camera. If the extra megapixels aren't going to benefit you, if you aren't doing focus tracking of moving subjects, the a7 III is still a really great camera. And in fact, you can pick one up used for a pretty good price. But the a7 IV, really, really impressive. Right up there with the Canon R6. And I would not hesitate to recommend it for hybrid shooters, wedding photographers, professional portrait shooters, sports shooters, and people who do a little bit of everything. It's like a great general purpose camera.
Again, we're going to be putting it up against the R6, so stay tuned and subscribe if you want to see that follow-up video. But so far, I think we're deciding that this is a great camera. So thank you.
Thanks.